This just happened, and it could change everything. In the middle of a war with Iran, President Donald Trump's Pentagon is now removing some of the most senior military leaders in the United States Armed Forces, and the timing is sending shockwaves through Washington, across allied capitals, and all over social media tonight. What critics are calling a wartime purge, supporters are calling a reset. But whatever phrase you use, this is not normal. When generals are pushed out while missiles are still flying, markets are already nervous, and the White House is warning of decisive days ahead, people notice. And now the biggest question is no longer just what happens in Iran. The question is what happens inside the U.S. command structure itself. Here's what we know so far. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has forced Army Chief of Staff General Randy George out of his post, effective immediately. The Pentagon publicly framed it as a retirement, but multiple major outlets, including Reuters and other U.S. networks, reported that George was fired or told to step down. That alone would be a major story under any circumstances. But this is happening while the United States remains deeply involved in a widening war against Iran, with American forces building up in the region and new warnings about possible retaliation still coming in. The Pentagon has now moved General Christopher Laneve into the role on an acting basis. And according to reporting from Reuters, 2 other senior Army figures were also removed: General David Haughton, who led the Army's Transformation and Training Command, and Major General William Green, the head of the Army's Chaplain Corps. Let me explain why this matters so much. The Army Chief of Staff is not just another officer. This is the top uniformed officer in the U.S. Army, the person responsible for preparing, organizing, and guiding the largest branch of the American military. Removing that person in the middle of an active conflict is extraordinarily rare. In fact, Reuters described firing a general during wartime as something that is nearly without precedent in modern American politics. And that is why tonight this story is being treated not as routine staffing, but as a major crisis inside the national security establishment. Now, this is important. General Randy George was not some unknown figure. He had more than a year left in his term. He had served in Iraq and Afghanistan. He had been confirmed to the top Army post in 2023. And he was closely associated with efforts to modernize the Army, to make it faster, more flexible, and more prepared for the kind of drone-heavy warfare the world has been watching in Ukraine and now across the wider Middle East. That means this was not simply a ceremonial change. This was a deliberate move made at a highly sensitive time with real operational consequences. And the context around it makes the story even bigger. Reports from AP, PBS, Politico, and others say this is just the latest in a chain of removals that now stretches to more than a dozen top military officials since Hegseth took office. We are not talking about one isolated personnel decision. We are talking about a pattern. Previous removals have included former Joint Chiefs Chairman General C.Q. Brown, Admiral Lisa Franchetti, and Air Force Vice Chief of Staff General James Slife. So when people online say this is a purge, that language is not coming out of nowhere. There is now a very visible trend: the senior officers being fired, sidelined, or pushed into retirement as Trump's national security team reshapes the Pentagon around a different political and ideological vision. But here's where it gets interesting and more controversial. NBC News reported that Hegseth has intervened in military promotions involving more than a dozen senior officers across multiple branches. According to that reporting, some officials inside the system are deeply concerned that qualified officers, including women and black officers, were being blocked or delayed for advancement because of race, gender, or perceived ties to Biden-era policies. NBC also reported that General George had wanted to discuss some of those decisions, especially after names were removed from an Army promotions list, but Hegseth reportedly refused to meet. If that reporting holds up, then this may not just be about war strategy or command discipline. It may also be about ideology, loyalty, and who gets to rise inside the military under Trump's second administration. Supporters of the administration, of course, see it very differently. They argue that the president and his defense secretary have every right to remove leaders they believe are out of step with the mission. They say civilian control of the military is a core American principle, and presidents are elected to set priorities. In that view, this is not panic. This is a cleanup. It is a correction. It is a rejection of what Trump allies often describe as a politicized officer class shaped by the previous administration. And for Trump's base, that message has real power. They hear firings and think accountability. They hear shakeup and think strength. But critics are asking a brutal question tonight. If this is strength, why does it look so chaotic? Why do this now, while the war is still active, while the Strait of Hormuz remains under threat, while U.S. allies are openly split over strategy, and while intelligence still suggests Iran has not been broken militarily? According to CNN, recent U.S. intelligence assessments indicate that roughly half of Iran's missile launchers are still intact, and that thousands of one-way attack drones remain in the country's arsenal despite weeks of American and Israeli strikes. Reuters also reported just days ago that the U.S. could only clearly confirm the destruction of about a third of Iran's missile arsenal. So the idea that this war is nearing a neat conclusion that does not appear to be backed up by all of the intelligence reporting we are seeing. That is why the timing of these firings is so explosive. On one side, the White House and Pentagon are talking tough. Hegseth has said the coming days will be decisive. Trump has threatened to intensify the conflict if Iran does not make a deal. Reuters reported that Trump even threatened to obliterate Iran's energy plants if Tehran did not agree to terms and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Iran, for its part, has answered with threats of its own, including threats against American companies operating in the region. And the wider war has already hit global shipping and energy markets. An oil tanker was struck off Dubai. Oil prices surged. Gas prices in the United States have climbed. Global trade routes are under pressure. So while this administration is trying to project control, the broader picture still looks unstable. And that brings us to the background that led to this moment. Since returning to office, Trump has made clear that he wants complete alignment inside his government, especially on national security, immigration, law enforcement, and culture war issues. Hegseth, a former Fox News personality turned defense secretary, was brought in not as a cautious manager, but as an ideological disruptor. He made no secret of his opposition to what he calls woke policies in the military. He has pushed aggressively against diversity programs, publicly questioned how promotions were handled under previous leadership, and signaled that officers connected to past Pentagon priorities could find themselves under scrutiny. So when you look at the firing of Randy George through that lens, it does not seem random. It looks like a continuation of a broader campaign to bring the officer corps into line with Trump-era politics. At the same time, the administration is also asking for more military spending, not less. Bloomberg reported that Trump is preparing to frame the Republican midterm message around a massive defense buildup, including a proposed defense budget of around $1.5 trillion for the next fiscal year. That is a staggering number. So, on the one hand, the White House is telling voters that America needs a much stronger military. On the other hand, it is firing some of its most senior commanders during an active war. That contradiction is one reason this story is landing so hard tonight. Americans are being asked to trust a bigger military budget while watching institutional turbulence at the top of the chain of command. And there is another layer to all of this. On the same day the Pentagon shakeup dominated headlines, Trump also pushed out Attorney General Pam Bondi. AP and Reuters reported that she is out, with Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche stepping in as acting Attorney General. Trump praised Bondi publicly, called her a loyal friend, and said she would move into an important private sector job. But behind the scenes, multiple outlets reported that he had grown frustrated with her performance. Why does that matter here? Because it feeds the larger narrative that this White House is becoming more volatile under pressure, not less. When top legal officials and top military officials are being removed in the same political moment, the story stops looking like isolated discipline and starts looking like a sweeping internal reset. Public reaction has been intense and deeply divided. On social media, critics are using phrases like Thursday night massacre, wartime purge, and command chaos. Many are asking whether the White House is sacrificing military stability for political loyalty. They point out that in a crisis, continuity matters, experience matters, trust inside the command structure matters. And they argue that replacing generals mid-conflict can create uncertainty not only for troops, but for allies trying to coordinate with Washington. Some military veterans online are warning that the message this sends to the officer corps is chilling, that careers can now turn not on battlefield judgment or performance, but on whether one is politically acceptable to the people at the top. But pro-Trump voices are pushing back hard. They say critics never objected when previous administrations cleaned house. They argue that the military answers to elected civilian leaders, not the other way around. And they say if an officer resists the mission, blocks reform, or reflects the wrong priorities, then removal is justified, war or no war. Some conservative commentators are framing the firings as a show of seriousness, insisting that Trump wants leaders who will fight to win rather than managers who preserve the status quo. So yes, the backlash is fierce. But so is the support. This is one of those moments where the country is not only divided on policy, it is divided on the meaning of the event itself. Internationally, the concern is just as real. French President Emmanuel Macron has already criticized Trump's shifting rhetoric on the war and dismissed the idea of reopening the Strait of Hormuz by force as unrealistic. Macron's message was blunt: be serious, stop contradicting yourself, and return to ceasefire talks and negotiations. That matters because it shows that some of America's allies are not convinced by Washington's current strategy. And when allies are already uneasy about the war, sudden firings inside the Pentagon only deepen the perception that U.S. decision-making may be unstable at the top. So why does this matter beyond the personalities and the headlines? Because wars are not only fought with bombs, ships, and aircraft. They are fought with systems, planning, discipline, and confidence in the chain of command. When top officers are removed in the middle of combat operations, it affects morale. It affects coordination. It affects how adversaries read American strength. Tehran is watching this. Moscow is watching this. Beijing is watching this. U.S. allies in Europe and the Gulf are watching this. And every one of them is trying to answer the same question tonight. Is this administration decisively reshaping the military for a long fight or revealing deep instability under pressure? That is the central issue. Because if Trump and Hegseth believe they are building a more loyal and more effective war command, then they will say these firings were necessary, even overdue. But if critics are right, if this is about personal control, political filtering, and panic under battlefield pressure, then the consequences could be serious and long-lasting. Not just for this war, but for the future of civil-military relations in the United States. So tonight, the facts are clear, even if the interpretation is still being fought over. The Army's top officer is out. Other generals are out. More than a dozen senior military leaders have now been removed or sidelined under Hegseth. The United States remains at war with Iran. Intelligence suggests Iran still has significant retaliatory capability. Oil markets are rattled. Allies are uneasy. And the White House is showing no sign of slowing down. This story's still moving and fast. More names could surface. More explanations could emerge. Or the silence from the Pentagon could make the controversy even worse. But right now, one thing is undeniable. This is one of the most dramatic wartime command shakeups in recent memory, and its impact may be felt far beyond Washington. So what do you think? Is Trump taking firm control in a dangerous war, or are these firings a sign of panic at the top? Let me know in the comments, because this story is far from over.